So let's go ahead and jump in and look at some of these accessory structures of the integument. So the first one we're going to look at is hair. So hair is basically a hard keratin, just like we found in the skin, except it's not going to flake off, it's going to stay tighter together, and it's a harder version of that protein. Now, hair is made by the hair follicle. Notice what they're trying to show here. This is all epidermis, right? So this purple is epidermis. The hair follicle is actually an organ, right? It's made up of multiple tissue types, and we actually see it's epidermis that's kind of plugged in, kind of diving down into the dermis. It's not that far, it's like 4 millimeters, right? But it is epidermal in origin, but kind of hanging out down here in the dermis. Okay? It is an organ, we'll talk a bit. It has nerve endings associated, it has a very rich blood supply down here in the hair follicle as well. So this picture is super confusing, but it's showing a cross section. The hair itself is kind of from this white region in. Everything outside of this is part of the actual follicle where this hair is being produced. So if you look at a piece of hair in cross section, the very center is the medulla, right? This is kind of some bigger cells, some more open space, a little bit softer. In orange here, they're showing you the cortex, a little bit more outside. This is much harder keratin. And then in white here is the cuticle. It's very tough. These are the layers that are holding together tightly, give your hair the shine, all that sort of thing. Okay. Now, when the hair is being produced in the follicle, right, the hair is kind of pretty well finished when you're about halfway out of the dermis. We call that the hair shaft. That's kind of the finished keratinized version. The hair is being produced down here in what we call the hair root. And let's take a look at what's making up the part of the follicle here. So you have what is called the hair papilla. This is a little kind of bump of dermis coming into the follicle, bringing a really rich blood supply. What's not shown in this picture is that hair root plexus. That kind of wraps around the outside of the hair follicle, which is, right, hair in a lot of other mammals is for warmth. And maybe for us, some like hair on your head maybe is producing a little warmth, but honestly, even on your scalp, it's probably more about UV protection. But hair can be super useful for sensing insects and things like that. So having a nice rich nerve supply around the base here is important as well. What's actually developing the hair is this little cluster of epidermal cells called the hair matrix, and they're actively dividing cells that are producing these keratinized cells that make up the hair follicle. Okay. You also have smooth muscle cells associated with the hair follicle. Oh, I thought I had a better picture than that. In the cartoon version, they're showing that muscle. It's called the erector pili muscle. And this smooth muscle is going to actually pull on the hair and help it stand upright. So if you get cold and you feel like the hair on your arm standing up, again, in other animals that are hairier, by standing that hair up, you can actually trap a little layer of warm air closer to the body. Probably not a huge role in us. But this erector pili muscle, you'll see it as goosebumps, right? That's actually pulling on the little hair follicles. You just don't have a whole lot of hair there, right? Because you actually have different types of hair. The pale, fine hairs are called vellus hairs. I think it's 2 L's, vellus hair, as opposed to like the hair on your scalp or eyebrows, which is called terminal hair. There's actually another form called lanugo that really is only found during fetal development. So this is weird to think about, right? But as babies are born, they're often covered in this kind of fetal hair. They're kind of furry, and then that falls off and we start to develop other hair. Okay, what else do we need to know about hair? I think that might be it. Let's look at nails real quick. Not a lot that I want you to know here. Obviously, the nail body is the portion of the nail that you see, right? And it's protecting the tips of your fingers, the tips of your toes. It can actually work as a tool as well. The nail is also being produced by the epidermis, right? So they're talking about this nail fold. It's this little fold of epidermal cells that are producing the nail down here at the root, okay? This is where growth is taking place, right? Sometimes you'll hear people talk about the nail bed. See if that shows up on here, right? Which is really down here at the root, and then the nail, the plate, the body is going to move out. That's actually much worse to damage kind of down here than it is to smash, your finger with a hammer. This may turn black and blue and fall off, but it's if you damage the actual bed, the epidermal cells that are producing it. Okay, there's fancy names for the cuticle. I don't care that you go there. All right, let's talk glands. You basically have two main types of glands, right? We have sweat glands and we have sebaceous glands. Let's talk about each of those, right? So this is all showing sweat glands, and the technical term for a sweat gland is a sudoriferous gland, right? And sweat, you have millions of these sweat glands, right? Something like 3 million covering the surface of your skin, right? And these sweat glands are actually innervated. So you have nerves that come to these cells. This is from your autonomic nervous system, the involuntary part of your nervous system, and it can trigger the release of sweat. Now, when we talk about sweat, sweat is really 99% water, right? It is created from blood, right? We actually filter the blood and let a lot of the liquid portions leave into a sweat gland, and we can put that onto the surface of our skin. I know a lot of time we think about there being salts in sweat, which is totally true, but it is actually a hypotonic, right? There is less salt in your sweat than there is in your blood. Most of what you're losing is water, right? But there's some salts. You can get rid of some metabolic wastes like urea and ammonia. You can lose some antibodies, even things like vitamin C will come out in sweat. But I'll come back to this time and time again. 99% water in your sweat. Sweat tends to be slightly acidic, somewhere between like a pH of 4 and 6. And this is actually important probably in helping to keep some of the microbes out. It's kind of an inhospitable environment. The skin is usually dry, which is kind of inhospitable. The water content could make it more hospitable to microbes, but a lower pH probably helps protect us there as well. So when we look at these sweat glands, a couple things to keep in mind, right? There is a duct going to a surface. So if you remember, we talked about glands. This is going to be exocrine secretion, right? A duct to a surface. And these sweat glands, at least the common ones on the surface of your skin, they are called eccrine sweat glands. Right. Most of your sweat glands are eccrine. We'll come back and talk about a few that go to hairs. These eccrine sweat glands, I'm sorry, this is annoying, use merocrine secretion, which if you think back to chapter 4, meant the products of the cell were being packed in little vesicles that could then leave the gland. Okay. So that is the majority of your sweat glands. We do have some sweat glands that are associated with hair follicles that are called apocrine sweat glands. These are going to be associated with hair follicles, and this might help you remember their location. They're very kind of restricted. Exocrine or eccrine sweat glands, sorry, these are all exocrine. Eccrine sweat glands are all over the surface of your skin. Apocrine sweat glands are really in the axillary and anogenital regions. Right, so apocrine, axillary, and anogenital regions. These really don't become active until puberty. Right? These are not just secreting water, right? So the sweat that comes out of these glands tends to have more fats, right? Some proteins as well, and that is actually what this isn't for cooling. In fact, scientists aren't exactly sure why we're making these particular secretions, maybe some kind of scent that in sexual maturity other individuals can smell, we're not sure. But this is also where you get BO, because these apocrine sweat glands have protein and fats in the sweat. It provides a food source for bacteria. And so as the bacteria start to degrade those substances, you get BO, which really kind of kicks off at puberty, right? So maybe that kind of makes sense. So we have eccrine sweat glands and we have apocrine sweat glands. And here is maybe the most frustrating part. You'd think with a name like apocrine, it would be apocrine secretion, but it's not. It's still merocrine. Those little vesicles going to the surface and being released, right? So again, the name of the sweat gland, the type of secretion, the name of the sweat gland associated with hair follicles, the type of secretion, okay? That's not confusing at all. You do have a couple other sudoriferous glands or sweat glands that are much more specialized. The mammary glands are actually a modified sweat gland. And then also the ceruminous glands, which are the glands in your ear canal that produce earwax. Right? Those are both modified sweat glands. All right, on to sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are almost always associated with a hair follicle. Again, this gland has a duct, secretes to a surface, so we know it's exocrine. But these sebaceous glands use holocrine secretion, which, if you'll recall, means the entire cell kind of packs full with its products and then the whole cell rips open. What's being released here is what is called sebum. And this is really an oily substance, right? It contains triglycerides, it contains cholesterol, it's got some proteins, right? We'll just call it fatty, right? So sebum, the actual exocrine product here, is kind of a fatty substance. It's being released primarily on hair follicles, and it actually kind of lubricates the skin, lubricates the hair follicles. Absolutely, these glands are driven by hormones. Right? And again, at puberty, we tend to see, right, big spikes, changes in hormones, much more production of sebum, and then particularly in the facial area, bacteria can get involved here and trigger things like acne.